All right, episode 49 of Exit Liquidity. We got Alex Zvanevic, CEO and co-founder of Nansen. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, we'll just jump straight into it. Can you give us a bit of insight on your background, how you got into the ecosystem, and what it was like when you kind of first entered the space?
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, thanks for the great promo video you guys put on Twitter for this stream. This is the funniest thing I've seen in a while. Yeah, so my background is initially in AI. I graduated in 2010 with a master's in AI. It wasn't that cool then, but now it's become very hot, of course. I spent some years working as a management consultant after that to learn more about business. I spent some years as a data scientist and a data science manager. And then in 2017, I discovered Ethereum. And I fell down the rabbit hole very quickly during the ICO boom of 2017. I ended up leaving my job as a data science manager and moved to Hong Kong to build a data team for an ICO startup. To make a long story short, that startup failed very quickly. And late 2018, I was left without a job, but with a very expensive rental contract in Hong Kong, which at least at the time had the most expensive real estate in the world. So I had to figure out what to do next. And I spent some months, almost a year, working with other great companies as an independent data science consultant, effectively. So I worked with 0x for a while, helping them with DEX slippage analytics. I worked with a great mobile gaming company called Amanotes in Ho Chi Minh City. And then a few other customers I worked with as well. And then at the end of 2019, myself and my now two co-founders at Nansen basically realized that, there's something around on-chain analytics that's very interesting, and we should be doing something in that space. And so we had the initial idea of creating like an API where you could look up addresses, Ethereum addresses, and then just get information about those addresses back. That was the first version of Nansen. And then later on, we realized that you need something that's a bit more full stack. So we ended up creating an analytics platform where not only could you look up addresses, but you could also get real-time transactional insights and so on about those addresses. So that's how we ended up creating Nansen launching Nansen in April 2020, right before DeFi summer. That's roughly how I ended up working full-time in crypto.
Awesome. And you just jumped straight over Bitcoin? Ethereum just kind of clicked for you?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think I first seriously, well, not very seriously, but I first spent some time learning about Bitcoin in 2012 or 13. And I kind of came to the boomer conclusion that it didn't have any future and that it was only going to be used by criminals and so on. So I just ignored it for the next 4 years. Also, I thought it was too late in terms of the price action, like you always do. It's like, oh yeah, okay, there was some friend of a friend who had made, I don't know, $500,000 investing a small amount of money in Bitcoin at the time. So I thought, okay, that's probably it. This is the top in 2013. Of course, that's how wrong I was. But I think the thing that was different about Ethereum is I always had this feeling with Bitcoin that maybe you're betting on the wrong horse. So sure, you kind of get the idea of a blockchain, but how do you know that this is the right currency, that this is the thing that's going to take off? Whereas with Ethereum, because it was positioned as a platform where you could create lots of different currencies and lots of different applications permissionlessly, that seemed like a safer bet to me to effectively invest in the kind of infrastructure layer rather than like the single application that to me Bitcoin represented at the time. I think there's a bit more nuance to that, especially recently now with things like inscriptions and whatnot with Bitcoin. But generally speaking, I kind of preferred the platform approach that Ethereum had, and that's what drew me in 2017.
Awesome.
What did the Ethereum ecosystem look like back then in your mind? Because me and Cito, I think both got in like in a more involved capacity, like 2021, maybe 2020.
Mm,
And I always hear about what things were like. I mean, 2017, wasn't that long ago, but in crypto for us, it's a really long time. And I
yeah.
always imagine like things back then were a lot more like just like lawless, like Wild West cyberpunk type stuff. Like, kind of how did you see the space back then, or the Ethereum ecosystem specifically?
Yeah, it was very dominated by the whole ICO boom. And that's kind of the main activity that was going on with Ethereum. People were just publishing white papers, doing ICOs, and with the promise of these applications that were going to be created on Ethereum. And of course, as we know, most of those ICOs failed, but there were some projects that have actually made meaningful contributions to the crypto space that came out of that era. And sometimes they're not overlooked as project, but we kind of forget that that's how they were started. The most notable one is maybe Binance, right, which was started in 2017 through an ICO. I think the market cap was, or when the valuation of the ICO itself for Binance was like $15 million, which is kind of wild to think about, that retail investors could participate in the initial financing of such a massive company today. But there were some other ones too, like 0x that I mentioned before that I worked with in 2019. They also had an ICO in the summer of 2017, and they've contributed very heavily to the whole DEX space and DEX aggregators with Matcha and so on. Kyber Network is another example. And so there are some interesting projects that were started back then. But it was very dominated by this kind of speculative mania around ICOs. And I think, interestingly, we didn't have a lot of the infrastructure back then, because that was precisely what many of these ICOs were intended to create, like DEXs and so on. So the closest thing you had to a DEX, which was things like Ether Delta, which was this terrible DEX that, like, the user experience was just complete garbage. And I think you would, if I recall correctly, like both the execution of the trades as well as the order book were on chain, which is like, it would never work with the gas fees that you have today. And it was like half of the time it just didn't work, and you had to like, it felt like a centralized exchange, except much clunkier. You had to deposit funds into your account and all these different things. So I don't mean to like dunk on Ether Delta, because at the time, it was innovative and in a way revolutionary, but it was also a terrible user experience. So you had to kind of just do these workarounds with everything you were doing, because so much of the infrastructure was not in place. I don't know if I'd call it like cypherpunk, because I think very few people during that era came in because of the ideology. It was mostly the kind of mania surrounding ICOs. But I think many people were brought in maybe with an initial, greedy intention, but then you kind of stayed because the space was so interesting in many different ways. Like, there's a lot of intellectual capital in the space. It's kind of a unique industry where you have people with lots of different backgrounds, whether it's computer science, finance, economics, sociology, art now through NFTs and so on. And so I think many people, well, I don't know what percentage, but many people were brought in because of the greed, but they actually stayed because they realized that this is a really interesting industry. And for me, that was certainly the case, that I realized that this is probably going to be the future of finance, as the meme goes. And I realized that even though there's so much speculation, that is probably the way that you are going to be able to fund all this infrastructure. So that's been the view that I've had since then, and that I still hold. And it's kind of one of the foundational principles for why we created Nansen, that yes, we are, facilitating the speculation of meme coins and monkey JPEGs and penguin JPEGs and so on. But all this speculation actually finances the creation of the infrastructure, which is going to be used for real world assets and all sorts of assets in the future. So yeah, that's kind of how it was back then. Of course, many people ended up just leaving in 2018 when prices went down. And 2019 was very quiet. But I think many of the builders were actually quite active in 2019, including myself. And then, of course, in 2020, DeFi summer kicked off kind of the next run. And then 2021, you had the whole NFT mania and so on. So yeah, it's definitely been some interesting years since I joined.
Yeah, there's always been a level of speculation that I think will never go away. And like you said, there's a benefit to it for the entire ecosystem. The show is called Exit Liquidity. You've had a long journey in the ecosystem. Do you have any moments or memorable instances when you were Exit Liquidity in that journey?
Yeah, probably many. Where to start? Maybe a recent one was when Azuki launched Elementals. That felt like I was being Exit Liquidity somehow. I'm not going to say it was like a flat out scam or a rug, but when I saw the Elementals, I had one Azuki and I saw the Elementals and I was like, wait a minute, this is just the same thing. They just diluted the whole collection by like 3 or 4x or whatever it was. And so I was like, I should just dump my Azuki. But then I was a little bit slow and I could just see people exiting and the floor price going down. Eventually I ended up selling the Azuki and I've never looked back. That's maybe one example that comes to mind. I think I was also Exit Liquidity. I think, Alameda was, using me and others as Exit Liquidity and some of their DeFi shenanigans. I think maybe there was a project called Platypus on Avalanche, where I think I was doing some kind of liquidity provisioning and ended up probably losing money. I can't recall. There was also one with the one where Mark Cuban lost a lot of money. There was some kind of algorithmic stable coin.
Oh,
I also remember. Yeah, Titan, or I think there might have been another one as well. It might have been that one
as well.
Sorry, what was the other one?
Right.
The Ohm fork, Klima DAO.
Klima, okay.
Yeah,
it was one of those. It might have been Titan, where we got refunded though later on, and so I think I was able to get out. Yeah, but it's crypto, so you have a lot of examples of that stuff happening. That's part of the game.
Definitely. Yeah, I think it's definitely something that brings us all together, is we all have our own stories of how we've been burned, or we've made poor decisions, or we've gotten greedy. It's the cost of doing business here. I feel like it makes us one.
Yeah.
Going back over to Nansen, or I guess like the earlier days of Nansen. So you mentioned like you had a background in data and AI. You and your co-founders kind of saw a need for this infrastructure. What was I feel like a lot of startups, or most startups, have a sort of North Star that stays the same throughout their development process. What was Nansen's like North Star? What was your main goal that you were building to, or what you wanted to be? And like, how is that different today, if at all?
Yeah. So I would say that one of the main problems in crypto is that there's so much noise. It's very hard to keep on top of everything, and you probably shouldn't keep on top of everything. So a key challenge is really to find out what are the things that truly matter, and to get those delivered to you as fast as possible. And then specifically, our kind of foundational principle was that the most interesting stuff actually happens on chain, because that's where people are making the transactions. And so our North Star from that perspective is to surface the signal. It's pretty simple, but that's always been the goal from a product perspective. We want to make sure that for example, some people ask, like, maybe if they haven't used our product, it's like, how is what you do different from, say, Etherscan? And I think Etherscan is more like an encyclopedia. Sorry, it's like a reference guide, an encyclopedia of sorts. Whereas Nansen is more like a newspaper. So we don't try to give you everything. I mean, in theory, you could look up anything you want, actually, in Nansen. But we try to have a bit more of an opinionated perspective where we say, look, I think this is what you probably should be looking at. Not to say that you should buy the token or sell the token, but this is something that we think is interesting for lots of different reasons. Whether it's a token that some smart money addresses are buying, or it's some new smart contracts that are being used very heavily and have lots of gas consumption in the last 15 minutes or hour, or they're dApps or chains that are used more recently, right? So we try to surface the signal, and it goes back to what I said earlier about speculation and how it leads to the creation of infrastructure. Our belief is that if we can help both investors and builders surface the signal, then we can help them become winners. And so investors who are able to grow their portfolios, or builders who are able to build the right products that actually solve problems and attract users and liquidity. And if we do that successfully, then they are building the future of finance, right? So that is kind of how we think of our role and how it contributes to the creation of a new financial fabric for the world. So, we are in many ways like kind of a supporting player that tries to help both investors and builders create this new financial fabric for the world.
That's interesting. I like the analogy of like, if Etherscan is an encyclopedia, Nansen is like a newspaper. I think, especially with like how Nansen 2 looks now, it definitely like feels like a newspaper. Like that's like the closest thing I would compare it to, which I hadn't thought of before. So I feel like that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. If you use our feature signals, which is new in Nansen 2, that's almost like a feed. You're going in and you're kind of reading the latest stories, or you're seeing like the equivalent of like the latest tweets in your timeline. And you don't really have to think that much about like, what is the thing I want to look up, whether it's an address or a token or a chain or protocol, whatever. You just go into the signals page, and then you're presented with interesting, exceptional, or extraordinary events that have happened on chain. So yeah, that's what we're building towards. And it was pretty cool, like when one of our team members came up with that feature. It literally, our mission is to surface the signal. So it was cool to have a feature that's literally just called signals, right? And it's been one of the features in Nansen 2 that people have liked the most. So it's cool to see.
Yeah, it's definitely one of my favorites. I'm a big fan. Where did the idea for the name come from? Because it's definitely one of the more unique ones I've seen, but I feel like it fits well, and it's like almost like a household name at this point, even like in crypto or in crypto data.
Yeah, so we're named after a polar explorer, someone called Fridtjof Nansen, a fellow Norwegian like myself. So he was an explorer, and my kind of the way I think about crypto is that the people who both invest and build in crypto are pioneers. Like, we're doing stuff that we're going places where no one has ever been. And so the analogy of a polar explorer who ventures to the North Pole for the first time, I think is a pretty good analogy. You have to have a lot of curiosity to go there in the first place. You have to have a lot of courage. And as such, I think Fridtjof Nansen is a great kind of embodiment of our values, both as a company, but also for the entire space. He was also a scientist and a humanitarian, so there's some element of kind of, you can sort of be a renaissance person in crypto because it touches on so many different aspects like science, technology, economics, ideology, politics. And so I think that's another way that he's a good embodiment for the whole space and kind of a symbol for what we try to achieve.
Yeah. You mentioned features like Signal. You were early into the, I guess, if you want to call it the AI ecosystem. Nansen 2 has some AI elements built in. And more recently, AI and crypto have seemed to like merge in a symbiotic kind of relationship. How do you think about those use cases developing and those worlds colliding within Nansen and even beyond Nansen?
Yeah, so since I graduated in 2010, there have been two big revolutions in AI. The first one was with deep learning around 2013, 14, when suddenly machine learning systems became as good as humans at things like object recognition or image recognition, to some extent, natural language understanding, etc. And then more recently, we have the kind of transformer era with GPT and of course ChatGPT that many people know. So I think especially with the GPT era that we're in right now, not just the blockchain space or what we do with Nansen, is impacted by that. I think that's genuinely, a revolution for the whole world, and especially for like software companies. So even if we kind of set aside for the fact that we're operating specifically in the blockchain industry, anyone who runs a tech company and maybe even like who runs a company, generally speaking, has to think differently about like how they run the company and what kind of products they build, because you can do things now that were just genuinely not possible to do like 2-3 years ago. So the way I think about AI for our company is in two main ways. First of all, we should use AI for product innovation. So specific features that we are building that are powered by AI, and I can get into some examples in a moment. The other way I think about AI is for organizational productivity. So basically, like any task that you're doing at work, you should really try AI first, meaning you should try to solve the problem or get the task done with the assistance of AI, because most likely you're going to be able to do it faster and with better quality if you're doing it with an AI than if you're doing it without one. So that includes, anything from coding to writing research to creating designs to developing strategies and creating org structures and preparing like meeting agendas, literally everything, right? So I think that latter point is generally not as well understood by most people. Like I think people haven't realized how insanely useful ChatGPT and other AI products can be. And so I think a lot about that just in terms of how we run the company. And one of the goals we have for this quarter is to collectively spend at least 5,000 hours working with AI as a team. So if you just sum up like literally all the hours that we spend as a team at Nansen working with AI. In terms of features specifically for the product, there are many things, but I think, again, you can group it into two main areas. One is how you interface with data and analytics. And so an example of this would be using natural language to kind of interrogate data. So instead of you having to rely on someone else making a dashboard for you, you can sometimes maybe just write what you're looking for with natural language. So you could sort of imagine going into Nansen and just smashing Command K or going to the search bar and writing, why is Ethereum gas so high? And then it sort of understands that and gives you back like a chart or an explanation of what's going on, right? So that's about the interfacing with analytics and data. And again, I think this is something that's going to change very dramatically in the next few years, where maybe dashboards become kind of like a middleman that you can eliminate to some degree, where the dashboard historically has been something that sits between you and the data, but maybe now you can more directly just speak with the data, right? And then I think the next version of that, if you've ever seen the movie Blade Runner, the original Blade Runner from the 80s with Harrison Ford, there's a scene where Rick Deckard, the protagonist, is looking at an image on his screen, and he has this kind of voice and visual interaction with the screen where he's saying enhance and like zoom in, pan to the left, go to the right, zoom in, and this kind of bouncing back and forth with like voice commands and visual responses through the screen, I think is maybe how people are going to be interacting with data and analytics. And I often think about that. If I think about Nansen in like 2025 or onwards, I think there's at least one way that you can use Nansen, which is purely through maybe voice and gestures. And then you're having a kind of more interactive way to interrogate and explore data. I don't think the visual part goes away. I don't think it's a ChatGPT interface where you just have text. I think it's going to be something where you kind of bounce back and forth speaking with the data, and then you're going to have like visual responses from like on the screen, or maybe through something like the Apple Vision Pro. So that's one part, the interfacing with the data, which is going to be very much AI powered, because it requires natural language and kind of an understanding of the commands that you're giving the computer. The other part is around creating data assets or deepening the data moat that we have. So many people know Nansen because we're really good at labeling addresses. And this is what we refer to as attribution. So we have more than 300 million addresses that we have descriptive labels for. Like, here are all the Binance addresses, or here are some addresses that have been very profitable trading on DEXs, et cetera, et cetera. This is an example of something that I've referred to as proprietary abstractions. What it means is we're kind of creating an abstraction for you as a user, where you don't have to do a lot of work figuring out what are the most profitable addresses or which addresses belong to exchanges. We've done that heavy lifting for you with our own proprietary algorithms. And then we kind of abstract the way that research and simplify it into a label. And so naturally, that process can be very much improved with the use of AI. And I think there are other types of data assets that we can create using AI as well. And so maybe certain like indexes where you aggregate information, and you create new types of metrics, etc., can be AI powered. So anyway, so to take a step back, on the product side, those are the two main areas where I see AI becoming much more present in the product. The first one is on how you interface with the data, and the second one is on how you can create these proprietary abstractions and generally deepen the data moat that we have.
Yeah, definitely a lot of interesting stuff there. I think as someone, and I think most people in our space are like this, but as someone who consumes a lot of data, a lot of different data sources, but doesn't necessarily like have a more meaningful way of interacting with it. Like, I'm not someone who's going to go and make my own dashboards or like do any of my own coding. I'll use, tools like Nansen, Dune, DeFi Llama. Having a more like meaningful, interactive way to interface with the data is definitely like a big need of mine that myself, and I think a lot of other people also like it's not really something we've been able to overcome yet. I know Dune recently introduced Dune AI, which has just been creating dashboards with the use of like text prompts. Still pretty early, like it's not really been useful to me yet, but it's definitely cool. It's like, I think, a layer back from what you were talking about, like creating your own interface versus like speaking to the data directly using AI. Kind of tangentially related to that, I'm curious as to what you think other like intelligence or data companies in crypto do well that like Nansen isn't necessarily trying to do? Like what are some players in the space who like you respect and you like what they're doing?
Yeah, I think that's the right way to think about it, by the way, because typically products should be differentiating, right? And you're having a strategy means that you have like your area where you play, and then you have a certain set of principles for how you win, and they will be different from different products out there. And so I think like there are a few different ways that Nansen is very different from Dune, for example. I think Nansen has always been very much like no code and not built for like analysts, but built for investors and traders. And so that's why many people come to Nansen. They're like, hey, actually, I don't need to code. I don't need to get someone else to build a dashboard for me. I can just actually directly work with what's already available through features, alerts, dashboards, etc. I think the other way that we're a little bit different is that we are focused specifically on investors mostly, right? So that means we try to solve for those use cases of performing like discovering new assets, NFTs, etc., and performing due diligence on them from the perspective of an investor. And that means, you have to think about the whole workflow. We also have portfolio tracking, right? And so that's something that's going to be integrated more into Nansen 2, where you can have this kind of full stack investor. I almost think of it as like an on-chain co-pilot. And I don't mean co-pilot like literally as kind of the GitHub Copilot, where it's kind of a little chat interface. It's more like the concept of a Copilot, like someone who's there next to you, can help you with stuff, but knows all your preferences, knows what has the context of your goals and your investment strategy and so on. So I think like over time we will become more of kind of a full stack on-chain Copilot for investors. What I think, but at the same time, there are also other good portfolio trackers out there, for example, right? So generally, my mental model is that Nansen is very much kind of a platform that does many different things. But then you have other products that are more vertical and more kind of niche in what they focus on. So like Zapper or DBank, to me, would be examples of kind of pure play portfolio trackers. They have dabbled in kind of adjacent areas. But of course, I would argue that we are kind of on a path that's going to be ultimately more useful to investors because we support more chains. We have data that no one else has with regards to the attribution we do. And it's going to be more full stack when we integrate portfolio into Nansen 2. Then I think there are players like Dune and Flipside that are more focused on this kind of community created dashboards, right? And so one thing that I think they're good at is the speed from there's a new project out to you seeing a dashboard on those platforms that have been specifically built for that project. That is just kind of an inherent benefit of having the community approach where someone can quote unquote permissionlessly create a dashboard, right? At the same time, one thing I found a little bit frustrating is that very often you could potentially do exactly the same thing with Nansen without coding. So, for example, if you wanted to see who are the main recipients of an airdrop, you could literally do that by going into the top recipients dashboard in Nansen's wallet profiler section. But it's something that you kind of have to be a power user of Nansen to even like understand that that's how you can use that feature. So I think the community powered products like Flipside and Dune, they have an edge there because it's easier for people to understand. Here's like the DYDX airdrop dashboard than it is to understand here's the top recipients dashboard in Nansen that you can use for the exact same thing, but it's actually a more universal tool and no one needs to code it for you, right? So that's kind of just a trade-off between the two different approaches. We are kind of no code and offer kind of universal tools, whereas they are more like, let's have the community create these dashboards, which can then be kind of tailored very specifically to a specific project. Then other products, I mean, I think Messari is maybe another product that tries to be a bit more of kind of a platform play that does both research as well as market data. They've dabbled with some on-chain stuff as well. But yeah, so I think there are many different information products out there, and like naturally the space we operate in has very low barriers to entry, and that's good for users and consumers because that means you get new products coming out all the time. And what it means for us is that we just have to make sure that we are the leading product that offers the most value. And that's kind of how I think about it. Like, there are tons of smartphones in the world, but there's only one iPhone. There are tons of electric vehicles in the world, but there's only one Tesla. Similarly, there are lots of crypto analytics products or information products, but there's only one Nansen. And so that's how we position ourselves. We're not really the cheapest alternative. We're not, we're not really trying to be the product that, how should I put it? Yeah, we're not really a product that always tries to either be free or be the cheapest version out there. Instead, what we try to do is maximize the amount of value that we create. And so that also means that we charge more for the product because it actually forces us to place the bar higher. Like, we have to build a better product in order to justify the price tag of the subscription. So that's kind of a very, I think, different philosophy than many of the other information products in crypto that optimize very much for kind of, let's just make it free and figure out the business model one day, or, create a token and hopefully something will work out someday. But the approach we have, I think, is more sustainable and more long-term oriented, which is basically just, if you can help your customers win, then they're going to love your product, they're going to continue using it, and that offers a sustainable business model for you to build and grow the company as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's kind of cool to see how you guys differentiate in the way you think about each one of those components: cost, utility, the type of user you're targeting. I want to shift over to like some more market focused stuff, or like more broad in the space. For as long as I have followed you, or like followed Nansen, or been a user of the product, Pudgy Penguins has always been like, I feel like it's always been, for as long as I've seen you, it's been your PFP. It's been a pretty big thing throughout like the whole team. I'm wondering like what your first thoughts were when you came across that project, and like how you felt about it, where your conviction came from.
Yeah, so I think there were two moments in my, maybe three moments in my journey with Pudgy Penguins. The very first one was my friend Tom, who works at Dragonfly. We worked together at 0x in 2019. I saw him tweet about Pudgy Penguins, and he said, I think there was someone who had put a CryptoPunk on a billboard in San Francisco. And then Pudgy Penguins had done their launch, I think, the day before. And he kind of made a snarky tweet where he said, look, I'm just going to say it, no one's ever going to put Pudgy Penguins on a billboard. And when I read his tweet, I was like, man, someone should really put Pudgy Penguins on a billboard. And so I kind of jumped into some random Telegram group where lots of people who had just bought a bunch of Pudgy Penguins were in. And I said, look, we should put Pudgy Penguins on a billboard. Like, how do we make this happen? And long story short, some guys actually found a way to get Pudgy Penguins on a billboard in the center of KL in Malaysia, because it was during COVID and there were no people there. So the billboard advertising costs were extremely low. So for like a few $1,000s, they were able to just get Pudgy Penguins on a massive digital billboard in KL, Malaysia. And then we filmed that and put it on Twitter and like, hey, look at this. Now you actually managed to get Pudgy Penguins on a billboard. That's how I initially got into the project. Then I met a lot of interesting people in that Telegram group, and I just realized it was a hilarious community and a very fun community. And I didn't really own many pudgy penguins at the time. I think I owned like 1, 2, maybe 3. And so when I started posting about it, it was never kind of a shill your bags type of move. In fact, I kind of restrained myself and I did not buy more because I was concerned that people would think that I was just shilling my bags and was going to dump all these NFTs on people later on. But, you know, I was kind of part of the community. I thought it was, the art was cute. And I have an investment thesis around cute. I was also a seed investor in Axie Infinity, which of course is very cute and turned out pretty well for me. And so later on, when Luca came into the picture and he acquired the IP and the project, that was kind of the second milestone, right? Because then I realized this guy is actually going to take this to the next level. And I listened to him and I thought he had a great vision. And and the more I learned about Luca, and still the more I learn about Luca, the more impressed I am. I think he's just one of the absolute top CEOs in our space, and he's only like mid-20s. Super impressive guy. So that was the second part. And he kind of brought the third C to Pudgy Penguins, which is content. And he had this very clever strategy of getting the IP of Pudgy Penguins out there beyond just the bubble of crypto. So I can't remember how many billions of views Pudgy Penguins has on Giphy now, but it's one of the top IPs on Giphy. And it's been such a good strategy to just have these Giphies with Pudgy Penguins in there and producing lots of content with GIFs. Similarly, they have, I think as the only NFT collection, more than 1 million followers on Instagram. So he kind of ventured out, and of course we know about the plushies in Walmart and on Amazon, the toys. I bought a bunch of toys for my nieces and nephews for Christmas. And at some point he asked me to be an advisor to the project as well. So we've met up in person here in Singapore, and we've chatted about certain things. I helped him a little bit with the fundraise and so on. So those are probably the 3 milestones. Like, firstly, I kind of randomly fell into the project based on Tom's tweet about the billboard. And then second, when Luca came on board and took over as the CEO, I realized that this is actually going to go somewhere, not like beyond the bubble of crypto. And then third, when I came on as an advisor, I was able to, I think, contribute a little bit more behind the scenes with regards to the fundraise, how to think about the company, and so on. So that's kind of my journey summed up.
That's great. That's a great journey into an NFT collection. That's probably like one of the best I've heard. We used to ask a lot of people about their PFPs in general, and it's a very interesting one. When you first met him, you've created Nansen, you built Nansen to great heights. What were some of the pieces of advice, pieces of gems that you kind of gave to Luca, if any, or that you have for like any other entrepreneurs in the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think certainly just around the fundraise, there were some kind of tactical pieces of information I gave him. How to basically pitch the project. And I think Luca is interesting because he is very much how should I put it? He's like a hustler, and he's very business minded. And that's actually a little bit different than many kind of classical VC backed founders who are more maybe like visionaries, but they are not as focused on things like revenues. And so I actually really like Luca's style, because I think that's the mindset that any entrepreneur should have. But when it comes to fundraising, you need to kind of change your pitch a little bit so that it's more compelling to a VC, because the VC might not care so much about how much revenues you're going to make next year. The VC wants to know like how high is up, right? Like how big could this be potentially? And so kind of thinking a bit about that pitch, and by the way, like Luca is also a visionary, which anyone who's listened to him will know. So I think it was more about kind of having him lean in more on that part of it, and less on kind of the revenue part and like all these different things. That was one thing. And then again, some tactical things about like the fundraise. Maybe also just kind of telling him about what I saw as strengths of the project, you know, the kind of the 3 C's, right? The community, and the content. Some of this stuff has, I think, helped them understand what their strategies should be. And by the way, I think this is probably stuff that he would have or maybe already had figured out himself, right? But yeah, those are some of the things we talked about. Specifically from Nansen, I think there aren't like a ton of, besides the fundraising piece, I don't think there are that many parallels, because the businesses we run are actually very different. I would also say I've learned a lot from him, and just seeing how he is able to articulate, you know, his vision and how he's able to inspire his team. I think, to me, that's very inspiring in its own right. So, you know, by no means would I say that this is kind of a one-way relationship. I've definitely learned a lot just from interacting with him as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned being on both sides of that coin, raising your own rounds and advising. What are kind of some projects in the ecosystem that you're excited to see grow or launch over the next year, 2 years? And how deep are you into the weeds on chain these days?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you bring that up, because, you know, that's actually been my strategy. That my belief is that I can do a better job as a founder if I'm also on the opposite side of the table with other companies, as an investor or as a board member, in the case of Wallet Connect, where I'm on the board. So my thinking is, basically, I can, as an investor, see how other founders communicate to their investors, and then I can learn from that as a founder in how I think about communication, for example, to my investors, and how they approach fundraising, hiring, lots of other things. And so that's generally been my approach, right? And so I would say some projects that I'm definitely bullish on, and, you know, these are in most cases portfolio companies of mine. I think Monad is a very interesting one. It's a chain that basically parallelizes the EVM, which is a narrative now that's become very popular in the last few months. But I think they were the first ones to really focus on this. Wallet Connect, I think, is one of the massive infrastructural projects that so many people use. In many cases, they don't even know that they're using it. I don't think there are many projects in the space that can kind of claim to have several million, you know, monthly active users, but Wallet Connect is one of those products or technologies. I am actually, you know, I said I was an Axie Infinity seed investor. I'm still really bullish on the whole Ronin ecosystem, and I think they had to go through maybe a bit of like an identity, not crisis, but more like an identity search, where they had to accept that maybe Axie like can't be the only first-class citizen on the Ronin chain. You have to open it up to other games too. Of course, they always knew that, but seeing how maybe how some other Web3 game founders have thought about Ronin, everyone always felt like Axie is kind of the first-class citizen, and then you have all the other games. I think now that's changing a little bit, and so it's going to be super interesting to see which other chains are going to, other games are going to launch on Ronin. Cypher is a Web3 game that I've mentioned a few times, both in our Nansen Alpha Discord as well as on Twitter. I've played that game myself a lot. I think it's probably the most, and not probably, it is definitely the most fun Web3 game I've tried. It's actually genuinely a super fun game, even regardless of the Web3 angle. And that's going to launch, I think, in public alpha this month, at least this quarter. So that's, I think, one to watch out for. I have to say also I've been quite impressed by the LuxRare team. that kind of have pivoted towards more like gaming and betting after not succeeding as well as they hoped on the NFT marketplace side of things. So I think that's a team that just ships and, you know, has been able to pivot. Another kind of pivot that's interesting is Beam, which used to be, I mean, it's still Merit Circle backed, but they've kind of focused on creating their own gaming focused L2, and it's had a lot of price action since they've migrated from the MC token to the Beam token. Yeah, so there's actually lots of interesting projects either launching soon or that have already launched. And yeah, I think it's a really exciting time now. We're going into probably the next bull market if we're not already in it.
Yeah, definitely a lot of interesting names on there. I'm surprised to I didn't know you were so into gaming. I think there were a lot of gaming names on there, which is interesting to hear. It'll be it feels like every year, every bull market is like people are like, now is the time for gaming, and it never really is. So I'm interested to see if this time it'll be different. Yeah.
It's like institutions as well. Institutions are coming, but actually, I think with gaming, on the one hand, you could argue that gaming has kind of always been a part of crypto, like with Satoshi dice and all that stuff. But actually, my thesis here is very simple, and I've been saying the same thing for like the last 2 years. It takes time to build a great game. So if you raised money in 2021, you have to spend some years to actually produce the game. And so there's this interesting phenomenon where the crypto hype cycle is kind of out of step with the game development cycle, right? So you had tons of hype in 2021 and to some extent maybe the Q1 of 2022. Everything was priced super high, and then everything collapses because the game is not out yet. And it's like, dude, you have to give it some time to see the teams that raise money actually build the games. And so I think, to me, Cypher is like the canonical example of this, right? They raised money, I think it was 2021 or 2022. They hired close to 200 people to build the game, which, by the way, that takes a lot of time and effort on its own to just find, you know, the 180 or 200 great people to join your team, onboard them, etc. And then you build the game, and now, you know, 2-3 years later, they're actually coming to market with what I think is a really good game. And so in that sense, I'm not sure I would agree that we've been saying every cycle that like gaming is coming. I do think this time is probably the time that we will see some high quality games come to market. I think Axie, you know, the credit to Axie for pioneering this space, especially the play to earn and kind of Web3 gaming economics and so on. At the same time, like, I think it's fair to say that it would be unreasonable to expect them to have nailed everything in the first try, right? And so I think Axie as well acknowledges that you have to experiment and kind of iterate and learn. And I think some people were a bit too cynical with regards to kind of how they viewed Axie, right? Because it had so much hype and so much activity, producing tons of revenues for a while, and then of course activity slowed down quite a lot. So I think they've been the pioneers, and I think the benefit that these new Web3 games have is they can learn from what Axie did and take the best parts and keep those, and maybe innovate and iterate on the parts that didn't work as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it'd be interesting to see kind of how the past learnings and iterations will fit together. We're about at time here. I have one last question, and I wish I had more time to ask it because it's a pretty broad question. But given that you've made it this far, I think like you guys raised Series B, I think it was, which most crypto companies like dream to get there. And given that, you know, for us and a lot of our audience, you know, it's a very entrepreneurial minded space. I'm wondering if you have like any sort of like broad strokes kind of advice for someone who is in like the early stages, maybe where you were in 2017 or like 2020, just before you started Nansen?
Yeah, I mean, when we started Nansen, we didn't even think about fundraising. We actually thought it would be kind of like a cash flow business. And so our focus was just on building a product that was so good that people would pay to use it. And if they would pay to use it, that would basically fund our cloud bills and maybe even our salaries, right? So when we went to pitch seed investors, we already had revenues and we were already growing really fast. So I think like the very simple, but at the same time very difficult advice is just to build a product that's really, really good and that actually solves a problem for someone. I do think that one problem that Web3 and crypto has is we sometimes do the inverse of that, right? We literally pay people to use our products. And that's like great for the users for a while, like if you get your airdrop and so on. But it totally muddies the signal of whether people actually get value out of your product, right? So what we've done is like very different in that regard from how many other Web3 companies operate. And by the way, I'm not saying like you shouldn't have airdrop or like that. Totally depends, and it can make a lot of sense. But fundamentally, you should build a product that's super useful and brings value to users, and you should have a way to sort of test that it is genuinely valuable, right? And for us, that test was like, will users actually pay for this product? And they did. And so I would kind of, I mean, from that perspective, what I think is the right thing to do for the whole space and for the world is just to build useful products that solve genuine problems. And then the fundraising thing, I think, just comes on the back of that. If you can go into conversation with a VC and you can show them kind of a hockey stick up into the right chart of, you know, users or revenues or whatever your North Star metric is, then immediately that's interesting to them, I think. So it kind of goes back a bit to what I said about Luca and maybe contradicts that point a little bit, but you actually can stand out, you know, if you don't just have this kind of boil the ocean amazing pitch deck, but you actually have real world metrics that demonstrate that people are using your product, then there's something there. I think that's going to catch the attention of most VCs. And then the question is just, as I said earlier, like how high is up, right? How big could this be? And then, of course, you need to have an answer to that too. You need to have a sense of what's the total addressable market, what's the moat that you have, and that goes back to what I said earlier on how I think Nansen can stand out in a very low barriers to entry space because we have incredible infrastructure, we have data that no one else has, you know, we have 300 million wallet labels, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think those are probably the three main things. You know, focus on building a really good product such that you can get that hockey stick chart, understand the total addressable market so you can communicate it to VCs, and then make sure that you understand what your moat is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's definitely like the obvious, or at least the build a useful thing. That's the obvious answer, but it seems to also be the contrarian one in crypto. Just because
Yeah.
just
for
because
sure.
of like
Yeah.
the nature of what we're trying to do. Like I understand why it is the way it is, but like also kind of going back to what has always worked. You know, that is definitely not common these days. And it is still very much a valid thing to do, as you know, as we can see here.
Yeah, I mean it is kind of, you can certainly imagine like a very perverse instantiation of the Web3 and crypto space where like the only thing we're doing is like forking some existing product on like the nth other chain, and then you're just airdropping people. And like what value does that really create for the world, right? Like sure, you might enrich some people, including yourself, depending on how it's structured, but it's not really moving the space forward, in my opinion. Like you should be doing something that's genuinely novel or at least differentiated, right? So if you're trying to solve a problem that is kind of being solved already, at least make sure that you have some differentiator that goes beyond like it's on the 47th EVM chain instead of the 42nd, right? So yeah, I think there are plenty of unsolved challenges in crypto, and there's so much work to be done, right? Like we're really at the kind of gold rush stage still, and there's plenty of infrastructure and plenty of applications to be built.
100%. Yeah, definitely an exciting time, and no sign of that slowing down. We're quite a bit over here, so good spot to wrap up here. But thanks so much for coming on. This was a lot of fun. Definitely really interesting to hear about where you've been, the way you think about things, and where we're headed.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. And that is